For centuries, just the word Viking has conjured up images of fear and, let's be honest, fascination. But the real story of how their age of raids and conquest began is so much more complex and, frankly, more surprising than you might think. Today, we're going to break down that perfect storm of climate, culture, and technology that unleashed the Norsemen on the world. All right, let's get into it.
Right. This is the image we all have in our heads. Now, the horn helmets, total myth. But that reputation for brutality, oh, that was very, very real. I mean, the chronicles written at the time paint this absolutely terrifying picture of these savage warriors just descending from the sea, leaving nothing but destruction behind them. But is that the whole story? No, not even close. The myth of just mindless, savage bloodletting really hides a much more fascinating truth. See, these weren't just raiders. They were some of the most seasoned navigators and explorers the world had ever seen. They were craftspeople, merchants who built trade networks that stretched all the way from Baghdad to North America. The word Viking itself, it was almost like a job description. Going a Viking meant being a sea warrior or a pirate. It wasn't who they were as a people. So if they were so much more than just raiders, where did that terrifying reputation even come from? Well, historians pretty much all point to one specific horrifying event: the brutal and shocking attack on the holy island of Lindisfarne in 793 AD. This is what's widely considered the official violent start of the Viking Age. And this, right here, is the million-dollar question. Why, at the end of the 8th century, did all these people from Scandinavia suddenly erupt outward with such incredible force? What was pushing them to leave their homelands and sail for foreign shores? To really understand that, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. So before the raids, Scandinavia was a really harsh, unforgiving place. We're talking mountains, dense forests, and absolutely frigid waters. Just surviving was a constant struggle. But a series of really dramatic changes were about to set the stage for this massive Viking outburst. Okay, so back in the 6th century, a massive climate crisis hits. Volcanic eruptions filled the sky with ash, which meant crops failed everywhere and famine just swept across the land. But by the 8th century, the climate had stabilized and actually improved. Scandinavia bounced back, and with better conditions came a population boom. And suddenly, you have way more mouths to feed and a lot more sons competing for the same very limited farmland. Now, this new population pressure landed squarely on a society that was already primed for conflict. For the North people, honor wasn't just about owning land. It was measured in wealth, in glory, and having great stories told about you. Boys were literally buried with weapons, raised on epic tales of legendary heroes. You had all these petty kings and chieftains in constant competition. And, maybe most importantly, their religion promised the ultimate reward for a warrior. Dying in battle was your one-way ticket to the golden halls of Valhalla. So you can see, right, this wasn't just some random impulse to go raiding. It was baked into the culture. If you were a young man with no inheritance, the way to make a name for yourself, to win power, or even just to get by, was to go out and take it. Violence was a totally recognized path to success. But they still needed one more piece of the puzzle. All of that ambition, all of that cultural pressure, it needed an outlet. And they found it in a revolutionary piece of technology that would, and I'm not exaggerating, change the entire course of European history. Now, let's be really clear. Scandinavians have been masters of the sea for thousands of years. They were totally used to the harsh northern waters, but their ships were primarily rowing vessels. Now, they were seaworthy, for sure, but they relied completely on manpower, and that severely limited how far they could go and how much they could carry. Then, in the 8th century, Norse shipbuilders added a truly transformative piece of tech, the sail. Now, sails had been around for ages in the Mediterranean, but they were new to Scandinavia. And when you combine the power of the sail with their traditional long, shallow draft hulls, you create a ship that's incredibly fast, agile, and can travel just vast distances across the open ocean. And don't underestimate what a huge deal this was. A single large sail was insanely expensive. We're talking the wool from over 200 sheep, and it would take a team of women 2 years to weave by hand. So this wasn't just some minor tweak, it was a massive technological leap. The true game-changing value of the longship was its sail. And that quote really sums it up perfectly. The sail gave them unlimited power. It took all that pent-up social pressure, that warrior culture, that burning desire for wealth and glory, and it just pointed it outwards.
All of a sudden, the treasures of Europe were within reach. So now we have the motive and we have the means, which brings us back to that fateful day in 793, the raid on Lindisfarne. This was not a random act of savagery. It was a smart, calculated military operation.
So why pick Lindisfarne? Well, just look at this checklist. It was a hugely important center of Christianity, which meant it was overflowing with wealth, gold, silver, precious artifacts. It was on a remote island, and by its very nature, it was completely undefended. Remember, in a world mostly without towns, monasteries were one of the few places where wealth was concentrated. For a group of raiders looking for maximum reward with minimum risk, it was the perfect target.
And they had a plan. They had intelligence. They knew to strike at high tide, when the causeway connecting the island to the mainland was totally flooded, cutting off any hope of rescue. The goal was simple: speed and shock. Overwhelm the monks, grab everything of value, and that includes people, and get back to the ships before anyone could possibly react.
So what were they actually after? Well, it was a mix of precious metals, coins, and a surprisingly large amount of human cargo. They ripped the jewel-encrusted covers right off of holy books and tossed the pages. But a huge part of the loot was people. Young men and women were taken as slaves, another valuable commodity to be sold or put to work back home.
The Vikings sailed home with their treasure, leaving death and absolute terror in their wake. But the impact of this one single raid would send shockwaves across the entire Christian world. This letter from the famous Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court, it just perfectly captures the absolute horror people felt. For Christian Europe, the idea of a pagan force attacking a holy site and slaughtering unarmed monks was simply unthinkable. It violated every single rule of warfare as they understood it. Of course, news of the attack spread like wildfire. And church leaders, trying to make some sense of the horror, framed it as a divine punishment. Alcuin himself wrote these frantic letters, urging kings and priests to live less sinful lives, basically claiming that God had sent these heathens to punish them for straying from the path. And Lindisfarne was just the beginning. It wasn't a one-off. The very next year, they hit Jarrow. The year after that, Iona and Scotland. And then the raids spread to Ireland. The Viking Age had begun in earnest.
Ultimately, the raid on Lindisfarne was proof of concept. It worked. It brought immense wealth and glory back home to Scandinavia. So with every single journey, the Vikings grew bolder. Their knowledge of Europe's coastlines expanded, and their targets became more and more ambitious. They started out as pirates, really, with these short, sharp attacks on the coast. But as they gathered more intelligence and more confidence, they would evolve. They'd move from just raiding to building armies, from plunder to conquest and settlement, and eventually they would leave their mark on the language, the society, and the very DNA of Europe itself.